So, in terms of the structure of today's presentation, what I'd like to do is try to convey to you at least four different ways to understand Japan-China relations through, I think, four useful books. I'd like to touch upon the future of Japan-China relations. And lastly, what I'm going to do is just reflect upon how I understood the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's contribution to bilateral relations, which I think is very important for us to be thinking about as the US-China strategic competition continues to deepen, and how countries like Japan, under the leadership of leaders like Prime Minister Abe, negotiated this very complex dynamic. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I think it's useful for us to, as we engage in looking at Japan-China relations, is to think about it at least in terms of these four books. Of course, there's many different books that have been written about this important bilateral relationship. But why I chose these different books is that they present different aspects of Japan-China relations over a historical period of time. The first one is Ezra Vogel's book on China and Japan Facing History. The second is The Middle Kingdom and the Empire of the Sun by June Tofel Dreyer. The third is a superb read by Rana Mitter, a China historian, on China's war with Japan from 1937 to 1945. And lastly is Asia's Reckoning, talking about the trilateral relationship between China, Japan, and the United States. Now, what's interesting about these four books is they really look at the bilateral relationships differently. The first book by Ezra Vogel, really one of the most prominent China-Japan historians, looks at the relationship basically from the Tang Dynasty, so that's back in the 8th century, all the way up to the contemporary times. And I think the critical themes that we can take home from Ezra Vogel's book is that these two countries, well, China used to be Japan's teacher 1,200 years ago. And then what we saw is a long period of isolation between these two states. And then in the late 19th century, as Japan modernized, westernized very quickly, and was able to push back against the European imperial powers and protect its sovereignty and its independence, we saw China fall to the European powers, that Japan became the leading nation within the region. And at that particular time, the Chinese, in an effort to self-strengthen and to repel imperial powers, decided to learn from Japan. And what we saw from the late 19th century, really up until the 1930s, is that many Chinese intellectuals, students, as well as other officials from China, whether it was the Qing dynasty or the Republican dynasty, come to Japan to try to learn how to modernize and westernize aspects of its economy, its political system, and of course its military, so that it could survive and negotiate the challenges of colonialism that they were experiencing. So during this period, despite the challenges of the bilateral relationship, we saw that the Japanese looked to China as an economic opportunity. They saw tremendous potential in fusing and working together with China to build an empire. And this view about China eventually led to, of course, Japan occupying Manchuria, setting up a puppet state, and eventually leading to war. On the Chinese side, again, they visited Japan, they looked to Japan as a teacher, and looked how they modernized successfully to maintain their traditions, but at the same time, modernize their economy so that they could compete effectively with the Western powers. This book eventually tilts to the war between the two states from 1937 to 1945, and touches upon, of course, the brutality of Japan in China, whether it's the Nanjing Massacre or the 731 live experiments on Chinese citizens, and the efforts of the Japanese to create an empire within the region. Following the surrender of the Japanese to the United States, we see Ezra Vogel talk about how these two states started to re-engage with each other after the normalization of bilateral relations in the early 70s under Prime Minister Tanaka Kakue and then leader Mao Zedong. From the 1970s onward, again, this was a period where the Chinese learned from the Japanese in terms of how to modernize their economy, how to create manufacturing networks within China. And eventually, again, this view of Japan as a teacher continued really up until the 2000s. And privately, I think that many Chinese would acknowledge that Japan still plays a tremendous role in China today in terms of development, the provision of technology, and investment at many different levels. And Ezra Vogel finishes his book in terms of talking about the bilateral relations as today, Japan losing some vitality associated with the 2 decades of stagnation, demographics, and really a more inward-looking Japan in many ways, that China could be in some ways a teacher for Japan in terms of how to have a more vibrant society, to be more competitive, to be more upwardly mobile. And Ezra Vogel ends his book in saying that today these two countries and these two important neighbors need to learn from each other to be able to coexist, but also to find prosperity moving forward. The second book was a little bit similar in terms of looking at the bilateral relations. Dr. Dreyer looks at the Middle Kingdom and the Empire of the Rising Sun from the viewpoint is that Japan has always had a very selective engagement with China over the centuries. And she highlights in the Tang Dynasty that the Japanese had a pick and choose approach to which Chinese culture they imported into Japan and eventually localized to meet the Japanese conditions. And she very much touches upon that once the Tang Dynasty collapsed, Japan retreated into an area, a period of isolation and very selective engagement with the Chinese, viewing China as both an opportunity but a potential challenge, and that they felt that the best way to retain strategic autonomy was to maintain as much distance from the various Chinese empires as possible. Again, her main conclusion, it really is that this relationship was one of in which Japan selected what cultures and the kind of engagement that it was going to sustain with the Chinese very much up until the end of the 19th century, when Japan modernized very quickly and decided to engage in China as an incredible economic opportunity moving forward. Her book, I think, is a very different take than some of the common Chinese narratives that really Japan was a kind of a vassal state that imported most of its culture from China and didn't really have any independence. And I think that her research definitely shows that this relationship has always been complicated. It's always been selective, and that both sides see each other very, very differently than I think the reality. The third book, which is a fantastic read, and I do encourage you to look at any of Rana Mitra's books, but this book in particular, China's War with Japan. Another title for this book is called The Forgotten Ally, which is worth again reading. It's just a different title. This particular volume looks only at the Second Sino-Japanese War, which dates from 1937 to 1945, or as contemporary Chinese historians write, 1931 to 1945. So they mark history very differently. Now, Rana Mitra looks at, again, the brutality of Japan's invasion, but also reflects upon how China has been very proactive in rewriting the history of the Second Sino-Japanese War to include themes such as China working alongside the Allies to defeat not only Japanese fascism at home, but to resist Japanese global fascism, including the Nazis, the Italians, and the Japanese. Rana points out that the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party of China, is very proactive in trying to redefine how China participated in the war with Japan, its critical contributions to promoting a new international system that was forged from 1945 onward, and trying to promote this idea of China's good war, in that it worked and sacrificed tremendous resources in battling Japan and Japan's imperial army for broader for the broader defeat of fascism. This narrative is becoming very, very popular within the Chinese context. And we saw back in 2015 when the Chinese government celebrated the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, they highlighted this new narrative of China's war against Japanese fascism and global fascism. So this particular book, again, highlights how different countries are proactively thinking about the wartime experience, how they worked, and how they, the party in particular, contributed to building today's China, but also defeating global fascism. Now, the challenges with this narrative, and it's not nothing wrong with Rana Mitter's scholarship, and as he points out, is the narrative is somewhat problematic. The CCP downplays the contributions of the nationalists and pushing back against the Chinese or the Japanese. They downplay the fact that the communists really sat out most of the war with the Japanese, allowing for the Japanese and the nationalists to fight each other and to weaken the nationalists for eventual civil war between the nationalists and the communists in China. The book also, again, tries to rewrite how China's fight with Japan was part of a global effort against totalitarianism and imperialism. And again, this is a really, really interesting way to be thinking about history and thinking of how proactive our Chinese friends are in trying to reconceptualize how we think about the Japanese invasion and how this was related to China being on the side of the Allies in terms of producing and building today's contemporary world order. The last book that I want to touch upon is by Richard McGregor. Now, Richard McGregor is a journalist, and he used to work for the FT, and spent many, many years in Beijing, but also Japan. So his deep experience in both of these countries as a journalist, understanding some of the major players and thinking about how these countries have interacted over many decades. Today, Richard is part of the Lowy Institute in Australia, and he spearheads their China program. And he's written some very, very interesting books, including The Party, which is about the Communist Party of China, and Asia's Reckoning, this particular book, as well as a new volume on Xi Jinping. Now, what's interesting about Richard McGregor's take in his Asian Reckonings book is he talks about the trilateral relationship between China, Japan, and the United States, and how this is related to the fate of the Asia Pacific when he wrote this book, or the Indo-Pacific today. And he highlights the challenges of, first, the bilateral relationship between China and Japan, but also the trilateral challenges between the three countries. In this particular book, he provides some real, I think, nuggets for people that are interested in the bilateral and trilateral relationship, highlighting that in the initial normalization negotiations between Japan and China, the Chinese decided to not request war reparations from the Japanese. He includes quotes from Mao Zedong telling Tanaka Kakue that when Tanaka Kakue was apologizing for Japan's imperial period, that Mao said that there's nothing to apologize. If it wasn't for the Japanese, the Communist Party would not have defeated the nationalists, and they wouldn't be in power today, and they wouldn't be working together. He highlights that the relationship between China and Japan has always been a complicated one, but one that was primarily negotiated through party-to-party relations. And as we know, China is a one-party state. But for much of Japan's contemporary post-World War II history, it has largely been dominated by the LDP. And it's this party-to-party relationship that has brought stability to really the first 50 or 60 years of bilateral relations, where problems, opportunities, and how the two states engaged were negotiated through middlemen or middle people in contemporary culturally appropriate words, would try to find opportunities to, again, deal with the challenges in the relationship. Now, in contemporary times, you've probably heard of Nikai Toshihiro, who is really one of those important individuals that acts as a middle person between the two countries. He is relatively pro-engagement with China. That doesn't mean pro-China or pro-CCP. It means pro-engagement. And he often during and post pre-COVID visited China to try and stabilize relations. And he used his party-to-party relationships and knowledge of the key players to try and stabilize relations. McGregor also talks about the complicated nature of diplomacy between these two states, where China in the 1980s or beginning in the 1980s and the political elite saw the utility of using anti-Japanese propaganda to consolidate political power within the Chinese context. We saw this first in 1986 when Deng Xiaoping, the second generation leader, had to court the PLA and anti-Japanese factions within the Chinese political sphere in order to consolidate his rule within the Communist Party of China. And since that time, what we've seen regularly is when we have a new leader that comes into power, whether it's Deng Xiaoping or Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao or now Xi Jinping, that we see an upturn in anti-Japanese sentiment as a way to consolidate political power within these states. Now, Richard also points out that there was always a complicated relationship between the three countries in that Japan was at first very much pro-China engagement, and the United States came really late to the game. And then as Japan became more wary of China's assertive behavior in its backyard, we saw Japan sending signal to the United States that there could be some concern. We saw Japan was the first country to re-engage with China after the Tiananmen Square massacre or incident in 1989 on June 4th. And eventually, Japan became the leading state to advocate for a more assertive and clear-eyed approach to managing its bilateral relations with China. So this last book really, again, focuses on the trilateral relationship, which I think is very, very important in terms of how these three states are engaging within each other. And this relationship has become even more important today. And Richard's book is somewhat dated, but today, the United States and Japan are working side by side and at a deeper level, not only in terms of defense cooperation and security cooperation within the region, but also harmonizing economic policy, and most recently, finding ways to cooperate in terms of semiconductor manufacturing by working between the United States, Taiwan, South Korea, and the Netherlands. So we see that this trilateral relationship continues to be very, very important. At the same time, Japan's biggest trading partner is China at $391 billion last year. And that trade relationship will continue to be important as Japan tries to maintain a sustainable economic trajectory moving forward. Next slide, please. So as we think about these four books, really we can sum them up, and I think the slide's coming. Good. That Ezra Vogel talks about Japan, China as students and teachers, where each country was once a student, but today they need to be teaching each other of how to solve problems, how to be more dynamic, how to be more flexible, and how to, again, face history in a way that they can start to produce and coexist together in a more productive way. The second book by Dreyer, again, talks about rivalry and selective engagement on both sides. And I think that this particular narrative is very true and continues to be true as Sino-Japanese relations become more stressed. Mitter's book, again, The Role of Japan in Modern Chinese Identity. And again, as many political leaders would say, there'd be no modern China without the Japanese invasion. And I think this is really, really critical. And it's something that not only I think the Chinese understand, but it's the Koreans as well. And lastly, Asia's Reckoning by Richard McGregor, focusing on trilateral relations. Now, I promised that I make mention of the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And I think that leftist interpretations of Prime Minister Abe are very critical of him. They often call him conservative, somebody that's interested in remilitarizing Japan, and someone that was unapologetically historical revisionist. I think that these interpretations are problematic. It was Prime Minister Abe during his second term as Prime Minister that forged a path to normalizing bilateral relations with Xi Jinping's China. This took time after the DPJ, the Democratic Party of Japan, had many challenges in terms of their relationship with China, eventually nationalizing the Senkaku Islands, which created almost 5 years of very disruptive bilateral relations. Prime Minister Abe visited Beijing in 2019, signed 55 memorandums of understanding for third country infrastructure cooperation as a platform for engaging in bilateral relations to find ways to shape the BRI from within and find ways to engage with China. If it wasn't for COVID in March 2020, Xi Jinping would have visited Japan for a cherry blossom party, and they would have likely signed a fifth political document that would have charted the next 10 years of bilateral relations. So Prime Minister Abe, rather than being militaristic and a conservative, was somebody that was steeped in realism, in understanding that the relationship with China could not be divorced, that in order for Japan to have a positive relationship moving forward, that it needed to engage with China, find ways to trade with China. And he did that by promoting the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, by promoting the TPP within the region, which does not include China. At the same time, thinking about resilience in the economy and building other partnerships, such as the Japan-EU Economic Partnership Agreement, and he also invested in deterrence. So Prime Minister Abe's legacy is with us today, and we see this not only in Prime Minister Suga's foreign policy, but also Prime Minister Kishida's foreign policy, and the new national security strategy that was released in late 2022, which focuses on defense, which highlights the challenge that China faces for Japan, but also the importance of cooperating. And again, this new national security strategy that Prime Minister Abe, I think, was influential in his passing and shaping, really touches upon the importance of engagement, resilience, and deterrence.